Many people do not understand the difference between a condo and an apartment, and often the term gets used interchangeably even though they mean two different things. But it's important for you as the renter to know the difference between the two, especially if you're having a hard time with apartment complexes that are requiring massive amounts of income to rent some crappy little apartment. So let's start out with the definitions of both of them. An apartment is a room or a group of related rooms among similar sets in one building designed for use as a dwelling. A condo, or condominium being the correct term, is an apartment house, office building, or other multiple unit complex, the units of which are individually owned, each owner receiving a recordable deed to the individual unit purchased, including the right to sell, mortgage, etc. That unit and sharing in joint ownership of any common grounds, passageways, etc. So the main difference that you need to understand between a condo and an apartment is how they are owned, because that's the main fundamental difference. Condos have one individual owner or landlord for you, and apartment buildings are usually owned by one company, person, or corporation that owns the entire building. So if you look at a building, for example, say it has 10 units in it and it's an apartment, then whoever owns that apartment building owns all 10 of those units. However, that place could easily also be a condo if it's a small condominium building, and the difference being then is that each one of those condos is owned by a different person. Sure, one person could own more than one of those condos, but generally speaking, each one of those 10 units is going to be owned by someone different versus being the entire complex owned by one person. Does that make sense? So then you might be asking yourself, why does this matter for me as the renter? Well, to tell you the truth, most of the time it doesn't really matter, but sometimes it does. So let's get into the reasons and the differences of why it might matter and why you may want to choose a condo over an apartment or vice versa. When you rent a condo, you are renting from an individual landlord who you may or may not have face-to-face contact with at some point, but you're going to be in touch with the landlord via some kind of communication, because you're going to need to communicate how the rent needs to be paid or if there's a problem with the unit, things like that. The only exception here is sometimes when you rent a condo, the landlord may have hired a property manager as like the middleman because they don't want to manage their own rental property, and so you may communicate with their property manager instead. That would be the one caveat to this situation. An apartment, however, is usually managed and run by an on-site property management company, and they are in charge of running the entire complex, and they're in charge of showing, renting, leasing, and any type of tenant complaints, collecting rent, repairs. All of these things are usually done through the apartment rental office. Like when you go to an apartment building, you'll usually see a rental office, and they're most of the time in charge of everything that has to do with the complex, no matter what it is. And so that person who's there is basically your landlord, even though they're not your legal landlord who's on your lease. They're the person that the landlord has basically designated to handle the day-to-day operations at the apartment complex. So chances are you will probably never meet your actual landlord if you're renting an apartment. So why does this matter? It matters because if you're dealing with an apartment, then usually apartment complexes have a strict set of criteria where you need to be able to pass all of their criteria points in order for them to consider renting to you. And the biggest one I've seen in the comments and as a complaint is needing to have 3 times the monthly income in rent. And that's just unrealistic for most cities, really, if you look at it. Just to rent $1,000 a month apartment, which is usually a piece of crap place in most cities in the country, you need to make $3,000 a month. And if the place is $2,000 a month, now you need to make $6,000 a month, which is more than most people even make. So you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. And to actually base someone's tenant worthiness based on their income alone is pretty much a big mistake for these apartment complexes, because it's just not realistic to expect people to make 3 times the monthly rent, especially with how stagnated wages have been over the past 40 years in the United States. And somebody that has a really good job and makes a lot of money probably isn't going to be renting some crappy apartment anyhow. They're going to buy their own place. But when you rent a condo, things can be more flexible. They can be talked out because you can meet the landlord and you can discuss your situation with your landlord individually and form a relationship with that person and basically get on their good side and prove to them that you can be a good tenant. And that is a huge fundamental difference between renting a condo and renting an apartment, because when you rent an apartment, you're never going to have that opportunity. You either need to fit in this box, and if you don't, you can't be a tenant here. And with a landlord, things are a lot more flexible and gives you more opportunity to explain your situation. Maybe your credit's not so good because you have high student loan debt, but you don't pay your bills late. Or maybe you don't make actually 3 times the monthly rent. Say your rent is $1,500 a month and you only make $3,000 a month. You're spending half of your monthly income on rent. But if you can prove that you've done that in the past and you've always paid on time and your past landlords were happy with you, then why wouldn't the landlord accept you? I would accept you. So that doesn't make any sense for the criteria to be so set in stone where, if you don't make a certain amount of money, you can't move in. That's just not right, really. And the reality is, guys, most landlords do not have this 3 times the rent rule. A lot of landlords are pretty flexible because they are human beings just like you and me. And at the end of the day, they just want to get their property rented out. And if they feel like they can get a trustworthy tenant, then most likely they're going to accept you even if you don't make 3 times the monthly rent. And it's also important to note that not all apartment complexes require this 3 times the monthly rent. I know some of them do, but some of them don't. And on the flip side, some property management companies that manage condominium buildings can have this requirement themselves, which is pretty rare as well. But just looking at condos alone doesn't automatically free you of this requirement. But just know that if you really want to make sure you can rent a place ahead of time before wasting your time going out and looking at a bunch of condos or apartments, it just makes sense to call at first and make sure that that's not one of the requirements before even looking at the place. And condos can come with their own set of rules as well, because in order to move into a condo, you need to be approved by the condo board or the condominium association. And this pretty much entails you filling out a application with all of your personal information, and they're pretty much concerned with making sure you don't have a criminal background and making sure that your credit is good and things like that. However, beyond that, it's usually up to the landlord to decide to rent to you or not. However, some condominiums can be pretty strict, and I've even seen condos here in Miami Beach where they have a minimum credit score requirement, some of them even being very high, like a 750 or higher, so that excludes a lot of people. Some of them have minimum income requirements. But in my last video, I still recommend that you look at condos versus apartments, and being able to work with your landlord on a personal level just gives you more of an advantage over somebody that's looking to rent an apartment and literally has no leverage. And the last difference between the condo and apartment comes down to paying the rent. Usually when you pay your rent with an apartment complex, they want you to stop by the office on the first of the month and pay the rent that way, or they'll have a different set of instructions that you need to follow each month to pay the rent. And with the landlord, that's another thing that can be negotiated of how they want to have it done. Like I've seen all different situations being in the real estate business here. It's very common these days to set up a direct bank transfer from your account to your landlord's account. Back in the day, people used to mail a check. In fact, when I first moved here, my first landlord used to come by my apartment and knock on the door on the first every month and pick up the rent like that in person. And I was cool with it. It was a little weird, but hey, you want to come by and get the money? Fine, I have it. Just come by and get it. So the situation can be different depending on the landlord and what's worked out between you and the landlord of how you're going to pay rent. Now, even though I got into the fundamental differences between a condo and apartment, I don't feel like I really covered the pros and cons list in this video. So depending on how well this video does, I may do a follow-up video all about just the pros and cons of renting an apartment versus a condo, because I didn't want to stuff it all in this video and make the video too long. So which one should you rent, a condo or an apartment? It really doesn't matter. All that really matters is that you can tell the difference and you know how to negotiate the best deal for yourself. And being able to recognize the difference between these two properties will give you an advantage when you're looking for a rental, mainly because you'll be able to move on to looking at condos instead of an apartment if you can't find any apartments that fit your needs. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like and go ahead and continue to hang out with me and watch one of my other videos right over here, and I'll see you guys over in the next one.